So we're going to be setting up scenes in 3ds Max to render. So I have a simple scene opened up here. I wasn't able to use the scene Jordan created because it had too many vertices. I couldn't open it on my computer. But this is a simple scene that has a couple lights and a camera in it. And this is our simple 3D scan here, which has quite a few vertices in it. So it should make it a little bit more to render, so we'll be able to see that. So in this scene, we can go up here to the top and go to my active shading. And we can see here that everything is ready to go. So we're just going to turn that back off and everything is lit up in our scene and looks pretty good. So to see how long it's going to take our scenes, another good thing, I always watch the performances of my computer. You can see when I previewed it, it used quite a bit more processing than normal. So if we go back to our active shading, we can see our GPU or our CPU bump up quite a bit more, almost up to 100% CPU processing. So just keep that aware. So now if we go up to the top and go to our teapot with the gear is going to be our rendering settings. And this is going to be our rendering settings window. We're going to be using Arnold to start with. So the first thing I'm going to do is go up here to my render view. And let's see, I want floating viewport 1. And that one I'm going to turn into my camera 1. And I'm just going to lock that one so it doesn't go anywhere. I can even close that. So now I can render one of my frames and we can see how long it's going to take. You have a couple windows that open up your rendering window. So it's up here once the rendering is done. And then here's my render going on the right side as well. So when it's done rendering, you can see down at the bottom left of the screen, it took 12 seconds to render that. I can get that to come back up if I hit render again. You can see last frame rendered was about 13 seconds. So that's not too bad so far. Um, just for example, if I go and I want to make an array of this part, it's going to have a lot more vertices. So it might end up um, being a lot more difficult to render. So we'll see how that goes. So if I get back into here and instead of doing an array, I just copied a ton of the same model in the back. So therefore, we should be uh, using a lot more processing power in order to render this scene out. So from here now, I'm just going to render a second scene, see if anything changed. Our first scene was at 13 seconds. So this second scene, we can see here if it's going to take the similar amount of time. And there, with more objects in my scene now, are at about 16 seconds. And I can go back to my camera view for this one. There we go. Block that one. Okay, so, and that render is taking 16 seconds at not too high resolution or anything like that. So we might turn this up, see if we can get a high resolution image and see how that's going to look. And then we'll start refining our rendering settings so that they work a little bit better. Okay, so this new frame here is at 35 seconds, we can see down there. So about 37 seconds or so for this new frame. So if I want to go through and start adjusting that, I'm going to start writing this down. So our first frame is at 37 seconds. Okay, and now we're going to go and start messing with our settings. So we kept the regular size here. This is pretty much the common area, is the most frequently changed settings you're going to mess with. Typically in industry, you would set up all your other systems and everything like that and only change your common settings just to change like your viewport size and active output of like your which frames it's exporting. So if I go to the second tab in here and go to my Arnold renderings, here we have a lot of settings that are going to start getting into this. So um, going through this one by one, in this general one down here, there's total rays per pixel. with no lights. So min and max, you can think every single pixel has around 117 to 180 ray traces for every single pixel in your frame. So it adds up pretty quickly. So same thing with how many samples are going on here. You can kind of think of the same thing where your samples here, if you have a diffuse, if you have any texture that has diffuse inside there, or like the specular right down below there, any of those, it's going to have twice as many ray trace paths or twice as many samples for this. So great way to start. I'm going to turn all these to 1 pretty much. The preview is basically -1. That's our preview that we select up here. Um, so our camera is going to be 1, diffuse is 1, specular is 1, transmission is 1, ray depth is also going to be 1 for that one. And then I'm going to turn SSS to 1. And then also, since I don't have volumes in here, I can turn that to 1 for right now too. So that looks good currently. I might start messing with everything else, but let's set that up for our second render. So I'm going to render this image now. And let's see. There we are. So this new render with just affecting those settings, it's a lot grainier, but it only took 3 seconds just changing those settings down. So that almost cut my time down by a huge amount. So that's going to be the start of what you want to adjust. All these should be 1, ray depth should be 1, and then volume, I guess it should also be 1, but if that's 0, we don't have volume in our model yet, so it won't affect our settings. Um, so that saved time, but we lost quality. So I'm going to write that down. All right. So we had 3 seconds, but it was bad quality. So we're going to see if we can increase our quality while keeping our renders within a reasonable time. So I might go through some of these other settings and do maybe adaptive sampling. That might see that it's going to need more areas back here, and we're going to see if that's going to render that out a little bit more. So just with adaptive sampling on, render a new frame, and we're going to see how long that's going to take. So let's see here. And just checking in on the process of my computer. It does get up to 100% GPU every time I render, but my memory is sticking at 13%. That's good. The issue I was having before, whenever that gets to the max memory of your computer, 64 gigs for my computer, you blue screen your computer and basically lose all the work. Yeah, so this is looking good so far. Um, With adaptive rendering, it is taking a lot longer so far, but it's looking a lot better. So we're going to see how that's going to turn out and see when it's done rendering. So that took about 54 seconds, but it looks a lot better. So it has all the detail in my model. There's not a lot of graininess. If I really zoom into some pixels, you can see some graininess in my render, but it's not bad. It's not noticeable. Especially in dark areas, you can't see it at all, but light areas here with light fall off, you get a little bit of noise. But that looks pretty good, but we did increase our time by a lot than before. So I'm just going to start labeling these numbers, make it easier. All right. So frame number 3 was about 54 seconds and really good quality. So that's good. We're going to see if we can start reducing that down a little as well. So adaptive samplings, AA samples. This one, we can read that there. So maybe I'll turn this one down from 20. See if we turn this down to 5, maybe a quarter of that. Render out a frame, see how long that's going to take. It's already responding a little bit quicker, so that's not too bad. So that's way better. We still have really good visuals. It actually even looks better than it did. I feel that it got rid of some of that noise, like this corner here in the shadow I kind of saw earlier, and there's other parts I saw more. So this looks cleaner, and we save time. So 21 seconds, and we're getting better results. So Frame number 4 is 21 seconds. And so it's kind of a balance where you just want to change one setting at a time, see what it does with this one shot. And once you get good time frames here, you want low frame rates per frame that still look good so that you can render out entire animations really easily. So now if we go further down, depth limits, ray trace total limit could probably also be cut down as well. Transparency as well. I don't have transparency, so we could even turn those down really low. I'll just leave them at 5. Um, Everything else down there looks pretty good. If we go to some of the further ones, there's like filtering and some other things in here. Sometimes I like adding things like motion blur into some of my renders. It makes it look more realistic and pretty neat. Um, Everything else looks pretty good in here. So let's render another frame and see how it's doing. All right, there we go. So that cut down by another second and still looks really nice by just removing some of those ray traces. Um, I think this area still looks kind of the same. Maybe it's just the way that light is positioning. It looks weird over that shadow. So it's kind of something I'm noticing now. But for the most part, everything else still looks really nice. If I really zoom in anywhere, it's not too grainy. Everything looks pretty smooth. So that looks pretty nice so far. So I can continue going from there, see if I can remove a little bit extra time. So going to the next time over, such as system, we have bucket scanning. You might have seen before I have those squares that are coming out when they render. And when that happens, that is your bucket of what is being rendered. And my bucket size is 64 pixels. If I change that to a different number, like 144, we can see if that's going to change how our rendering is going to be. That's mostly how it's basically affecting the GPU and how it's processing. A lot of times, leaving it at 64 is good enough. You can see here the bucket size is a lot bigger now, but it doesn't look like we're saving any time by changing our bucket size. Um, Here we go. So it rendered. It did get 1 second faster, so we could experiment with that and see how big it is. So if I do a 600 bucket size, now you'll see we'll have really big squares here. So there's a 4x4 grid here, and so there's quite a few squares left, but a lot less for it to render. Each bucket area is one section of the photo. Your CPU is basically focusing on and ray tracing that bucket, and then it moves on to the next bucket once it finds it good. That's why you'll see half of your render looks finished and the other half doesn't. So that went back up to 21 seconds. So it's not like we're saving any time. It's just changing processing for the most part. And our CPU was still reaching 100% at that. So I might just leave that at 64 pixels across, and that should be fine. I'll leave show bucket corners on. This should just be other things. I think everything should be fine in here. If we go down to the device though, rendering device, depending on your computer, it's good to try 2 different ones out and see if your GPU is going to be better than your CPU. So we're going to render this and see how it does, if it's going to render at all. So sending that to the renderer and see what happens. Okay, so GPU processing, we still have a similar quality as before, but we had 25 seconds. So mine might go back to my CPU since it's working on my computer specifically. And I'll just leave that there and go back to my other settings. Okay, so going back to this one, going back to my CPU, it was actually 24 seconds than before. So CPU versus GPU on my computer, it's not too much different. I'm going to leave it at CPU. It was working good for mine. From there, we can go to some of the other ones here. AOBs, I don't think I'm going to mess with there. But denoiser diagnosis, we can go in here and I think all this stuff we can leave here. Same with archive, unless you want to save all your renders. It might be useful for something like this where you can go and archive all your renders that you've been doing so far, but I'm just going to keep that off. Now my denoiser, this might be useful for intro animations like we're doing in our 3ds Max class, where they can get rid of any of the last noise that's inside here. So we can try one of these out. and see how well it's going to look for our denoiser and if it's going to save any um, information or any time. Most of the time in the industry, you don't use denoisers because you usually do that in post-processing. Um, the denoisers inside of rendering engines like Arnold or inside of any other program, they kind of are limited in what they can do. So a lot of times you'll have more control over it, taking it into After Effects and apply denoising. Um, Even with my denoiser, my image wasn't noisy to begin with, and it looks about the same as it did before. So I might just leave my denoiser off since it looked okay anyways. And that's keeping my renders right around 21 seconds. So that looks pretty good so far. Um, if I go back to my very first one in Common, now we can go through and edit these and see if we can kind of fine tune the last bit to get our render really refined. Pretty much there's effects in here or atmospherics. If we turn some of these off, I don't think I have any bump maps, so I don't need displacements either. We can see if that's going to save any time by removing some of those in our general common tab. So removing those, the image still looks exactly the same, but I did gain 1 second more, so it doesn't necessarily affect my current render. I might leave displacement in case I have bump maps, but I don't really have atmospheric or effects going on. Um, I could try going without advanced lighting, see how that's going to be. So I can render one of those out and try with just that one render setting and see how that's going to affect everything by turning advanced rendering off. And without advanced lighting off, it's still at 22 seconds, and everything else, for the most part, still looks the same inside my scene. Nothing has changed really. So whether I use advanced lighting, it doesn't necessarily change the output for this one. But I think that looks pretty good so far. So at 22 frames a second, and I'm at a high resolution, I would be happy to start rendering my animation for this one. I like having around 22 seconds, no more than like 15 to 30 seconds for each individual frame to render. At least on the level we're doing, industrial renders or professional renders, it might be a little bit different, but for what we're doing and the time frame and our constraints that we have, no more than 20 seconds per render is probably ideal. Because if we start looking at our calculator and measuring that out, so if we have 22 frames per 22 seconds per frame, but we have a frame or we have a render that our goal is 2 minutes for our video. So if we figure that out for 2 minutes of video, 2 minutes times 60 is going to be 120 seconds. And we have maybe our frame rate is 30 frames per second or 24 frames per second. I'll go with 30. That's probably what it might be set at. I usually go with 30 frames per second. It's a round number to do math with. So now it's going to be 3060 frames. If we multiply that by our 22 seconds, that's going to be 7,000 seconds. So divide by 60 for our minutes. 1,000 minutes, divide by 60 again. Oop. There we go. So that's going to be, was it 22? So we had, 130 minutes. So should be 22 hours worth of renders for the full 2 minute video at 22 frames per second. So that's for the full animation, so that's not necessarily individual scenes. So 22 hours at 22 seconds per frame. If it was more along how your renders were set up, say it was maybe a minute and 45 seconds for every frame pretty much. So a minute and 45 seconds, it's going to be about 105 seconds. If you times that by how many frames we had, which was, let's just do 105. So we have 2 minute video times 60 for seconds, 120 seconds times 30 frames per second, 3,660 frames, and we had 105 seconds per frame if it was for a minute and 45 seconds per frame. That would be this many seconds. So if we go to our minutes and then we go back down to our hours, that's going to be 105 hours of rendering time. And if you're doing this on your home computer, you can take 105 hours. I don't have a dedicated rendering computer, so that's 105 hours of rendering time my computer would have to do that um, is just going to take a lot of time. Even if you split up that render in multiple computers in the lab, you would still have 50 hours for two computers. That's almost a week worth of rendering going on. Um, so trying to reduce the individual frame time will save rendering cost, and that should improve the overall look of your renders as well. So just go over all those settings one by one, change just one setting at a time, see the result. Did you increase or decrease time, and did you increase or decrease quality? And you want to find that balance. You don't want bad renders, so you don't want to do it where it's the fastest possible rendering. You want to do it where it's still going to be a good render, where I was able to get the renders earlier where they could be 3 seconds, but they were really bad quality. So I would want to stay with the 22 seconds, 21 seconds for good results. That won't take too long, but it will still have the quality that I want. Yeah, so hopefully that helps. Message me if you have any other questions, and let me know.